Welcome to Paul or Nothing, the place to get all of your Paul all of the time. Join me, your host Sam Wiles, as we discover the history, the music, and the man behind it all, Paul McCartney. To get in contact with the show, email us at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com.
Guten Tag, hallo und willkommen in einer anderen Episode von Paul or Nothing, where we seek to dissect, inspect and collect every single post-Beatles McCartney tune, as well as speak Pigeon Joan for no reason. Oh, it's good to be back, folks. The reason for my frankly wacky antics on display there is simply due to the fact that I've just come back from interviewing a member of fucking Wings. Yeah, spoiler alerts, whatever. You saw Laurence Juber's name in the title. I know you did. There's no need for any false build-up or any greater suspense than there already is. You know what we're in for, and it's going to be great. Yes, people, we are actually going to be hearing from a man who was in the very band we are right in the middle of discussing at the moment on this podcast. And whilst Back to the Egg, the album that Laurence will appear on, is still a few months away, probably quite a few months away, knowing this podcast's release schedule. But I still think it's going to be some very insightful stuff, and to those people in the future, it's not going to matter anyway. And for those of you following along at home right now, I'd like to think you're doing your homework anyway and reading ahead of the class. I mean, I'm already routinely blown away by the quality of guests that a charlatan, fraudster, shyster, huckster podcaster such as myself has been able to get on this Tim Pot podcast recorded in the backwater of the West Midlands. But yeah, we've had some amazing scholars like Dr. Ken Womack, who we've had on recently, and Aaron Kdurvik, as well as some really incredibly insightful authors as well, like Howard Soons and Luca Paresi, who we're having on the show again soon. But this has been a real step in the right direction that I really wanted to start to head with the show from its very inception, getting people who are in the studio, engineers, session musicians, sound guys, techies, even the guys who used to fetch Paul's coffee. I don't really care. I just feel that we won't be able to get something genuinely unique and special if we can have someone who is actually there and be willing to help us close the gap between what we hear on the album and what it took to get there. And essentially, I reached out to Laurence. He emailed me back very promptly, which was quite surprising, and was willing to do this right away. And despite my flagrant fanning around, he managed to pencil me into his obviously very busy schedule and was willing to do this podcast with me. I felt so guilty because since I'd rescheduled when we were doing it, he'd actually missed a lunch appointment, and he was very, very hungry throughout this whole podcast. So please don't hold anything against him there. He's only human. But before we get too carried away, let's get the housekeeping out of the way, because this is an episode I really want to crack on with, as I'm sure you do too. Obviously, the best way to contact the show, is through the Gmail. That's at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. Anything you say is what I want to hear. It's not just my opinions on this show. We are a community, and I want to get your opinions about these albums out there too. Whether it's albums I'm going to be reviewing on that episode, past ones, albums in the future. Maybe it's an album I'm not going to be covering for another 4 months, but you want to get your opinion out there now. So maybe you can help inform my opinion or guide me along this journey that we're all going on. Maybe you've agreed or disagreed with something I've said on the show. Maybe I've missed something out. Maybe you've got your own personal little story with Paul that you've never told anyone before but you'd like to tell me. Again, email us at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. I'd love to read them out on the show. I read out a wonderful piece of correspondence for our Band on the Run episode. I want to keep doing that. Up next, follow us on the Twitter. That's at McCartneyPod. It's a wonderful little community we've got going on there. I love posting stuff there every day, and it's the best way to keep up to date about upcoming episodes and what's going on with the show. The best place to see all of the show in one place is probably the blog, which is paulmccartneypod.wordpress.com. That's paulmccartneypod.wordpress.com. It's basically a place where I keep all the little articles I write for the show, and it's the best place to find all the episodes, really. Basically anything that I make for this show, that's the best place to find it. And as with every episode, I must beg you for an iTunes review. It doesn't take that long. Just log on to iTunes, find the show, give us a little 5 stars. You know you want to. It's the best way to help out the show. It gets us a little bit of exposure out there in the wider web. Or even better yet, and speaking of helping out the show, there'll be a small announcement episode that I'll be making in a couple of days. That will be a little guide for any of you out there who would like to help the show in your own way. a more substantial way. But enough of that. What you're about to hear is about an hour and 15 minutes of my conversation with Laurence Juber, the final guitarist in the final lineup of Wings. I actually recorded this whilst I was visiting a few friends of mine in Leicester, most notably Danny O'Gorman, who designed our thumbnail, and Tom Quee, the host of the massively successful podcast Battle Rap Resume. Check that out. He will also be joining us to help us both with our Wings Over America and McCartney 2 reviews. Super looking forward to those. But if you can hear any little giggling twats trying to open the door or making noises outside of my little makeshift studio in one of the bedrooms, then you'll know what that sound is. Oh yeah, we take this show on the road, folks. In the following interview, I did try and fit in as much as possible into our short little designated window of space and time, as well as having like a healthy balance of like Wings and Back to the Egg talk, as well as trying to respect him as a guest and be aware of his wider work and asking him about other things he does, because he is human. He'll probably get bored of just answering the same 19 Back to the Egg questions over and over again. So for the sake of his entertainment and yours, I tried to make something a little bit special, and I think I did that. And I hope you enjoy it. Though since I am so overly critical of my work on this show, I will preface this by apologising in advance somewhat of the obvious nerves I think I display in the interview. I told Laurence about it after, and he was a little darling, and he said he thought I did okay. So who knows? I mean, obviously he's done loads of interviews, so I'd like to take his word for it. Look, enough of the host getting a little bit too softly meta for you. Sit back, relax, and listen to me pick the brain of a man who added a real rock guitar authority to Wings. This is my chat with the one and only Laurence Juber. Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special bonus episode of Paul or Nothing. Welcome to the life half anyway. I'm sure I've just come from a very erudite and wonderful intro. We're taking a break from our regular schedule of episodes, so to speak to someone who might have a slight greater insight into the toppings that we've been talking about on this show, probably more so than any other guest we previously had. And we've had some pretty smart people on here. But what I'm most excited about is the guy I have with me here today is also a Beatles fan, and that's one of my real passions in life, is getting to speak to these guys and getting to see how different people work and what they like and how it affects them in their life. The man I have here today is one of the last members of Wings. He joined in 1978. He was in the last lineup, joined with Steve Holley, and unfortunately the band only lasted around a year after that point, obviously with Paul's bust, just before the Japan leg of quite an extensive tour that was unfortunately cancelled. And he has done an awful lot since. In preparation for this interview, I was quite shocked to see just how much the man has done since that happened, and I've been getting into a lot of his music since, especially some of his Beatles albums that I will get into very shortly. Who do I have on here, folks? I have on here a member of Wings himself. In terms of, ever decreasing circles, he was one man away from the very man this show is based off. My guest today is Wings lead guitarist Laurence Juber. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you. I do have to give you a slight correction.
Oh.
That Wings actually continued for another year after the Japanese bust.
Right.
So my tenure with the band really was the best part of 3 years.
Oh, okay.
Because I joined as Steve Holley did, we joined in April of 78, and we were still working together in January of 81.
Well, yes, one of the things I was always quite amused by was you guys were in the music video for Wonderful Christmas Time, which, was that a Wings release, or was that definitely a Paul McCartney release at the time?
No, that was a McCartney release, but we were playing it on the UK tour, the November-December UK tour in 79. So it was kind of, there was a fluidity in that period between what Paul was doing solo and what the band was doing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you this a lot later, but I'd quite like to dive into it. It's an album I'm looking forward to talking about on the show. Did you listen much to McCartney 2 when it came out?
Yeah, I certainly listened to it. I mean, it was quite a departure from what we had done on Back to the Egg.
Yes, because obviously Coming Up was a US number one hit before McCartney released it on McCartney 2.
Yeah, the Wings version of it, the live version of it, was the number one record here, because the radio stations really weren't interested in the McCartney 2 version. The live version was more of a rock and roll record.
It was definitely the best live rendition of that song as well. I've seen Paul do it quite a lot over the years on TV appearances and such, and it never quite has that massive sound that a song like that quite needs when you guys did it.
Well, I think, one could get into a discussion as to how effective the Wings repertoire is when Paul does it live. I mean, it's great to see Paul doing those songs, but the one of the elements that really characterized the sound of Wings was the sound of Denny and Linda, joining in on the backing vocals, and how much when Paul does a Wings song, that's missing, to my ears anyway. But this is all. I mean, the thing about Paul is that his career has this long arc, and I tend to encourage people not to think of Paul as an ex-Beatle, but Paul as an artist whose first phase of his career was in the Beatles, but certainly has far more time, post-Beatles than he ever did during the Beatles. So,
of course. I definitely agree with you on your Linda and Denny backing vocal comment. I noticed that especially on Band on the Run, especially on songs like No Words,
right,
and Bluebird. There is a real moment when they did click, and they were almost in the zone, as it were. They did some of the best harmonies of their era, along with Paul and Linda's work on Ram, for example, as well. There were a lot of strong vocals there.
Oh yeah, I mean, Ram is a particularly special case because that's such a unique record. Not only Linda's contribution to that, but also Denny Seiwell's contribution to that record is a classic in pop rock drumming.
Yes, he's someone I'm also trying to get on the show, actually. But moving on, with Ram, was it an album that you were aware of when it came out? Because the kind of the media that surrounds Ram is that it was kind of panned when it first came out, and it's kind of had this modern revival, as it were. Do you remember it when it first came out? Do you remember liking it?
Yeah, I do remember when it first came out, and I always liked that record. I mean, Backseat of My Car, for example.
Of course.
Was it just had its own. It created its own world, and I think was a more accomplished piece of studio work than the McCartney album, which was great in its own way. But in terms of record making, I thought that Ram was really the kind of Paul's real follow-up to Abbey Road.
It really was. It was so much more professional and confident and assured than McCartney 1 was, which is a wonderful album. It's got so many whimsical and enlightening moments, but Ram, you are right, it is its own world, and you are just taken away by it. I'd say it possibly supersedes Band on the Run in terms of just its classic songs.
Yeah, Band on the Run is another case of its own. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of a discrepancy with that album between the production side and the songwriting side. Mm-hmm. Paul is an accomplished drummer, certainly, but it also, by comparison with the tightness and the orchestration of Denny Seiwell's work, mm-hmm. or the classic English big backbeat that Steve Holley brought to things, that Band on the Run is just a cool record in its own space. But I think that it doesn't necessarily rise to the same level as some of the other productions, that perhaps just in terms of the fact that it had been reduced to the core of Paul, Linda, and Denny. Paul, again, it kind of harkens back to the McCartney album in terms of Paul covering a lot of stuff. playing the drums, playing the bass, playing, and he has a certain way of doing things that is his style. But it's always interesting when you have somebody else playing drums, somebody else playing guitar or even keyboards. Just again speaking in the kind of not critically of his capabilities or of the end result as much as kind of in the meta level of critiquing record production.
It is one of those things where I do feel that Band on the Run, like Ram, like McCartney 1, does have a bit this extra juice of kind of Paul working against something, pushing back a little bit, and that I feel gives his songs a little bit of an edge that perhaps if he's a little more confident or relaxed he might not. Like the two albums that Wings did before you joined seem to be a lull point by critics and kind of fans alike. But were you ever aware of the whole catalogue once you started recording with Wings?
No, I wasn't.
Yeah.
I really wasn't deep into the whole catalogue. In fact, when I got the call to go audition, I borrowed some Wings LPs from my brother because I wasn't following on that level.
Did he have the whole collection, or?
No, I forget what I borrowed from him. I mean, it was, I think Speed of Sound and maybe Band on the Run. I don't remember. But I realized that I wasn't going to be able to cover as much territory as perhaps, not knowing what I might get thrown at me for the audition. But as it turned out, it really was, we just jammed on some Chuck Berry tunes and some reggae grooves. And I wasn't actually expected to just play that stuff. So for me, it was, Wings were kind of in the background. I mean, I was very much aware of the hits on the radio, but those, typically, I mean, Wings hits were pop records. They weren't a rock band in the way in which, for example, Aerosmith or some of the, or Boston or the big American rock bands of that era. I mean, Paul was still very much mining the pop sensibility that was the vector by which the Beatles repertoire kind of came into people's consciousness.
With Back to the Egg, I know I'm going to kind of flicker back and forth here, but it does feel like there is this definite edge that is pushing in one direction. Mm-hmm. With songs like Again and Again and Again and Spin It On and Old Siamster, which do have this real wonderful edge that really does excite me on a Wings album when there is just a little bit of grit. But it's always blended with that McCartney sensibility that is pushing it in the other way, that definite pop strain that perhaps doesn't blend 100% on all the songs, but is done enough consistently to really get across that he can essentially take any genre and work with it to some degree. I mean, Sea Moon was wonderful reggae. Held Skelter was wonderfully heavy as well. So there is that wonderful balance.
Well, I think Paul doesn't have any restrictions on his ability to address particular genres because he, as a musician and as an artist, has the capability of recognizing the bigger picture. And my philosophy toward music is that I don't see a clear division between classical and rock and jazz and blues and folk and all the different genres. I just see a spectrum where, sociological factors, commercial factors tend to push in a particular direction. But music, from an artist's point of view, from a composer artist point of view, is really a wide spectrum. But with Back to the Egg, there was a very specific circumstance there because Chris Thomas had been brought in to co-produce the record.
He'd worked with the Sex Pistols and bands like that before, hadn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he'd done the Sex Pistols. He would after Back to the Egg, would do the first Pretenders album. So he brought not only a rock producer sensibility to the project, but he also brought, he'd worked on a lot of concept albums too. And so even though Back to the Egg wasn't a concept album, there was a feeling of conceptuality about it. in the way that, using the "We're Open Tonight" to kind of set things up, and then bringing back the tag of "So glad to see you here," going along with the "We're Open Tonight" at the end.
Yeah.
It just kind of adds a little extra kind of substance to the flow of the record. But I think that Chris had a lot to do with keeping the rock edge in there, and Linda was always really good at kind of keeping things on the rock side too.
Where did the concept for things like reception and the broadcast come from? Because they're the things that kind of hinted at, okay, is this the concept that the album might be trying to go with? Like, was this meant to be like one seeming broadcast?
Well, yeah, I mean, reception was just the idea of kind of tuning in the radio, and that ties in with radio play me a song with a point in getting closer. So when we did that basic track, we did kind of jammed on that groove.
It's a fantastic groove. It really is. It's one of the best albums stars in the Wings catalogue.
Well, thanks.
It starts it off perfectly. I was like, okay, because I'm always honest with my guests. I had a certain reticence with Back to the Egg. I was like, okay, this is the last lineup. This is the album before the band broke up, and I was like, I'm going to go in with moderate expectations. This could be between, say, Red Rose Speedway and Venus and Mars. I'm going to go in with an open mind. And I went in, and very much like The Speed of Sound, there were certain soundscapes and shifts and moments that just completely caught me off guard. And Reception was one of them. The bass in that is phenomenal. Mm-hmm. It's very cool. It's a decidedly cool way to start a Wings album, and that is delightfully fresh compared to things like obviously London Town at the Speed of Sound, which did flitter with a twee sound somewhat. Well,
yeah, I think that to start an album with a funk groove, but then overlay all this other stuff on top. I mean, I played on the lead stuff. I was playing a guitar synth, and which I also used for the broadcast, along with Paul was using a prototype of a Gizmotron, which is a device that Lol Cream and Kevin Godley from 10cc invented, that you can push a lever and it bows the string to create a kind of a string, like a violin-like sound. And so I think that the way in which those tunes evolved was to some extent just kind of studio experimentation in terms of wanting to create some textures that were outside of the normal stuff. But, in terms of the broadcast, I mean, I never quite understood that one. I remember David Bowie came in to the studio, listened to that and said, oh, that should be the single. It should be a very kind of very left field Bowie-ish thing, to do. But I think that it's that eclectic nature that Paul has that is the root of all that kind of stuff. And it just sometimes you're in the studio, you start fooling around with something and it leads you in a particular direction, because clearly neither of those were songs that had been prepared, demoed, rehearsed or anything like that. They just kind of came out of the blue.
I've been far too indulgent, and I've let us talk about Back to the Egg and wander off topic. I'm going to bring things back just to kind of get your origins and your stories for the people out there, our listeners, who might not have read as many books on Wings and the Beatles as I unfortunately have. There's quite a wonderfully poetic origin story from your youth, I guess is the best way to put it, and correct me if I'm wrong. The tale goes that it's around 1963, you're 11 years old, and you get your very first guitar, and kind of within the next week, or in about a week, the Beatles release the phenomenally massive single "I Want to Hold Your Hand." Was this the moment where your life kind of shifted from one that was going to really focus on guitar from then on?
No.
Right.
No, the moment that my focus shifted really was when I picked up that guitar for the first time. But you got to put it in the context that was the kind of the first crest of Beatlemania was happening in that period. I mean, She Loves You was released in August of that year, of 63, and that had a big impact. And I was just chomping at the bit to play guitar. Got the guitar for my 11th birthday, which was coincidental with the Beatles' appearance on the Royal Command performance.
Of course.
And it just, which added a whole kind of legitimacy to what was going on with them. I mean, I went and bought With the Beatles, which was released shortly before I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Mm-hmm.
But just the Beatlemania was so looming, so large, but it wasn't the only thing for me. I mean, I look at pictures of my bedroom when I was, that age, and I've got pictures of the Stones, the Animals, and the Beach Boys up on the wall. And I was just as much a Stones fan as I was a Beatles fan. But the Beatles were transcendent. They transcended all the rest of the pop scene. There was everybody else, and then there was the Beatles. And so it was very, that was a major thing. But what I did was not just fall in love with the guitar. I was falling in love with music. Mm-hmm. And so I built a career on making music as a guitarist. And the idea of being a professional musician was the thing that, that by the time I was 13 and realized I could make money doing it, that was a big deal. But in terms of, and so that was really the turning point in terms of the career goal. But I was, the moment I put my fingers on the fingerboard, I was lost. I mean, I was in guitar world.
How many hours were you putting into guitar back then, do you think, when you were a young teenager then?
How many hours?
Yeah, how many hours per day?
Well, I'd basically rush through my homework and then play guitar. And I got into trouble skipping soccer games on Saturday morning, especially if it was raining, because I just stay at home and play.
It obviously paid off, didn't it? That's very good.
Well, it did, yeah. I can't say that the technique of being a guitarist was something that came entirely naturally. I mean, it was something I had to work at. It wasn't like I picked it up and I could do all this stuff. I mean, I had to develop technique, and along with that, I had to, I just found myself listening to music and deconstructing it. So the first opportunity I had in school to start studying music theory, and then, they brought in a classical guitar teacher, and so I started taking classical guitar lessons. All of it just was all conspiring to lead me into a career.
So, for me, I'd not heard much of your wider work before I started this podcast, and one of the wonderful things about it is that I've been able to branch out and go deeper and deeper and find all sorts of nooks and crannies and weird and wonderful albums. And in preparation for this interview, I'd started listening to your classical renditions of Beatles songs. And Lawrence, I say this with no sense of irony, or I have not stopped. I literally haven't stopped. I mean, from the moment I listened to about 3 or 4 tracks, especially something like on your latest one, Lon Stuber, Can't Stop Playing the Beatles. There was If I Needed Someone and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and they blew me away. They absolutely did. It was phenomenal.
Well, thank you.
It was a wonderful way of reinterpreting and revisiting songs that perhaps I kind of just thought were quite mediocre Beatle tracks.
Oh, first of all, let me address. You describe it as classical guitar, but it really isn't classical guitar in the broad sense of that kind of post-Segovia notion of what classical guitar is.
Oh, I'm not going to make any qualms with that. My knowledge of real music theory is horrifically low. I'm definitely more of a music fan.
Well, yeah, but I think it's important to recognize that there's a context for what I do. As an arranger for guitar. I mean, and now when I first started doing the solo acoustic guitar thing, which was back in the 80s, actually it was really during the Back to the Egg sessions that I first started writing some solo guitar pieces. And there was a piece called Maisie that we recorded that shows up on some of the Egg bootlegs. There was a kind of a Chet Atkins style picking thing that Denny played harmonica and Paul played bass on, and it's very exciting that pretty much my first composition I have Paul McCartney playing bass on. But when I really got serious about being a fingerstyle guitar player, a soloist in that respect, I did it as a composer, not as an arranger, and it was a process by which, having done a few Beatle arrangements, people just kept asking for more. And then my wife, Hope, kind of got very insistent that I should do an album. And so I handed her the production reins. And, since that happened, which was about 17 years ago, this is now the third album of Beatle arrangements. And at one point, Paul said to me, well, what about Wings? And so I did my One Wing album using some of the Wings tunes and post-Beatles McCartney stuff. In fact, one of my favorite tracks on that record is Another Day, which just turns out to be a really cool solo guitar piece. But fingerstyle guitar really has its roots in the same era as what we call classical guitar. And you go back to the early 19th century, and the great guitar players from that era were, as well as writing their own music, doing arrangements of opera, which was the pop music of that time. And so there's a long tradition of guitar players, making solo guitar arrangements that goes beyond what we look at as conventional classical, but it still uses a very similar technique. And that's really the world that I live in. And what I try and do with this stuff is just be very true to the tune, to the composition, the melody, and the harmony and the texture, and also to try and capture something of the meaning of the song, even though there's no lyrics there. And of course, with Beatles stuff, because the tunes are so familiar to the audience, they can they put their own reading of the lyrics in there anyway. But I just try and be true,
Yeah, it is very impossible actually to listen to your album and not sing along with it and inserting your own lyrics. But I must admit, I think if you've definitely tried to insert something unique and wholly your own into those compositions, I think you've definitely succeeded. Because, I've listened to 3 albums worth of Beatles compositions now, isn't there? And I've listened to all of them, and each time, each song has a different aspect and turn that I just didn't see coming. And it's always a joy to revisit those songs in a different light.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you appreciate it. I mean, it's what I do. Mm-hmm. It comes from getting inside the music and knowing how to communicate that musicality in a guitaristic way. Part of what I do is, as I use altered tunings, I might change the key or do something with the texture to make it more guitaristic.
Yes, there is definitely a sense of confidence when I listen to those arrangements. There's nothing shy or coy about them. Is there a difference between your favourite Beatles song and your favourite Beatles song to play on guitar?
My favourite Beatles song tends to be whatever one I'm listening to at the time. Because one of the glorious things about listening to Beatle records is they never sound the same twice. I always hear something different. And digging into those records, and this is an important point. If I'm doing an arrangement of a Gershwin tune, for example, or Harold Arlen, or one of the great American songbook composers, that typically there isn't a particular recording that is the benchmark. These songs get covered by a lot of different people in different kinds of, whether it's Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett or Lady Gaga or whoever. But then with a Beatles song, it's not just the songs, it's the records themselves that are so iconic. And so doing something like Strawberry Fields Forever or I Am the Walrus and getting in and digging out those cello lines and, George Martin's contribution to all of that. And those, or doing something like Angel Bird Can Sing, where the twin lead guitar line is integral to the song. Even though it's not the melody and lyrics, that is part of the composition. So, that becomes kind of the imperative for me, is to capture those nuances in the most effective way I can.
I was very pleased that you wonderfully captured Hey Bulldog. Hey Bulldog is Hey Bulldog's one of those benchmark songs for me, whereby if someone says they're like Hey Bulldog, I'm like, okay, Beatles, you've sat through Yellow Submarine, I can trust your opinion. On that note, did you discover that there was any Beatles songs that were just simply incapable of being transposed into a single guitar?
I'm sure I could figure out ways of doing some of that stuff. I mean, certainly, Revolution Number
about to
9
ask
is not
that,
going to
yeah.
make it onto a solo
I'd love-
piece. Yeah. And I actually seriously looked at doing Within You, Without You, but it was just going to be, I just didn't have enough time to really get into the whole, the raga sensibility of it to its full extent.
The one that I thought of instantly was I'd love to hear The Inner Light. I'd absolutely love to hear that one.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, there are songs that wouldn't necessarily be satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the ultimate criteria is this a satisfying performance or is it simply a rendition of something that probably didn't need to be approached at all? So I have to be very cautious about not overstepping the bounds of guitaristic reasonableness with all of that.
Also, just before I kind of dive into my Wings specifically related questions, you're also doing a tour that's coming to the UK soon. Is that to promote the Can't Stop Listening to the Beatles album?
It really is the tour. I mean, I'm just doing a few dates. I'm playing the Cavern, and I'm playing 2 dates at the Pizza Express Jazz Club in London in October. Those will all go on sale, I think, fairly soon. Mm-hmm. But I'm always doing concerts. Mm-hmm. So I tend to not just I don't do these isolated tours where I'll go out for 3 months as a single tour. I tend to do what I call guerrilla touring, which is, I'll go, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I did a run in California where I was up and down the coast over a couple of weeks, about 10 concerts. And then I've got a similar thing going on the East Coast in June. I have a lot of other projects on the go right now, so I'm tending to focus my touring very specifically. And of course, with a new album, there's always the opportunity to be promoting it. It opens a few doors for interviews and stuff like that. But in reality, I mean, it's this is I think my 25th or 26th album. So it's kind of an annual thing. Every year or 18 months, I tend to put out a new record. And my wife and I just started our own record label last year. So we're kind of wanting to fill that pipeline a little bit. But for example, the next record that I'm working on is probably going to be a jazz album.
Oh.
Or at least a jazz-oriented record. Whether or not I'm not sure yet if it's going to be solo or an ensemble thing or, some mixture. We'll see. But I did something similar for my Christmas album last year with my trio, where we did some California dates and then went into Capitol Studios and just recorded an album in 6 hours. And it actually turned out rather well.
In 6 hours? That even beats the Beatles' first album. Well done.
Well, if you've been performing and you know what it is that you're doing, it's just like do 3 takes and move on to the next tune. And that's the way it goes. It's funny. I mean, I remember when I first, after Wings, when I was living in New York, and I called up Paul, and I was telling him about what was going on with the project I was working on, and he would always refer to the Beatles as his old band. With my old band, we would do a bunch of gigs and then go in the studio. It's like, yeah, that's the way to do it.
Well, moving on from Paul's old band to your old band. I remember reading that you said your tenure with Wings was kind of like a potential master's degree in McCartney.
Oh, it was an actual master's degree, really. I mean, in terms of what I learned, yeah.
Is that a qualification you've kind of flaunted much in your extensive career?
Well, I mean, it is there. The fact that I played in Wings is just part of my resume, and it certainly was a door opener when I first got to America, because it was all very recent,
Yeah. How old were you when you were picked? Was it 25, was it?
I think I was 25. What was it, 78? So, yeah, I was 25. When I moved to New York in early 81, right after the January Cold Cuts sessions that we did, I pretty much got straight into studio work there, and I was working on a few projects, but then I met Hope, who became my wife, and she was from LA, and I came out to LA and liked it better than New York, and I ended up establishing myself as a studio musician in LA. And having been in Wings, it's a good credit, but you can't be a successful studio musician simply on the basis of a credit like that. I mean, I still had my skill set from pre-Wings, in my work as a studio player. So it's always been kind of part of Wings is part of who I am, but I also brought a lot of other stuff to to my career. And then, as a soloist, I mean, it's certainly promoters like to be able to tout Grammys and Wings and stuff, but there is a significant contingent of my fan base that got attracted to what I do as a guitar player, as a fingerstyle guitar player, with no reference to Wings.
I can honestly empathise with them. I've downloaded all of your acoustic stuff, and that's no bluff for the fans of the podcast to make me look like a super fan. I'm actually quite hooked on this, and it's very exciting to listen to it, I must admit.
Glad you like it.
In the same interview where I read that master's degree in McCartney quote, and not to take the tone down too much, you also said that it was not the kind of job that you turned down. And you cited the death of your father as a significant influence in why you joined the band. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more.
Well, it really had to do with the timing of it, because my father passed away in middle of March of '78, and I got the call, to go audition just a month later. I mean, just a few days, over a month later. So it was a period in my life where there was just disruption. It wasn't, I thought that I was on a particular path, and then things changed. And so I think that my father's passing kind of gave me perhaps the impetus to be more accepting of change. Because, having spent as long as I had to establish myself as a studio musician, and then to give it up, knowing that I was going to have to give it up in order to work with Paul, because I couldn't do both. I couldn't be available for Paul, but also be available to do studio work. And as it turned out, Paul was kind of somewhat reluctant to allow Steve and myself to continue doing studio work, because he felt that the band, at that point, he wanted it really to be perceived as a band.
Do you feel like the band was something your father would have encouraged you to join? Was the band a kind of...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm sure he would have. For me, there was no question about it. I mean, I say that, I had to think about it for a nanosecond.
It's a great quote.
Yeah.
No.
So, wouldn't you?
Oh,
I mean, if you were offered the opportunity to play lead guitar for Paul McCartney, you're not going to say no.
Oh, no. I mean, like, everyone who is a Beatles fan kind of has to come to terms with the fact that they can't be in the Beatles. I'm sure you had to sit down one night and kind of have the same thought, but you literally had the very next best option.
Well, actually, I got to play with 3 out of 4, so... and got to play with Paul and Ringo at the same time, which was just so cool.
And who was the fourth who you didn't play with?
Oh, I worked with George on the Shanghai Surprise soundtrack.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was in '86. So that was a few years afterwards.
Did the band kind of represent a kind of stability for you at that time, perhaps, that
yes.
you were looking for?
Yeah, I mean, it did represent a stability because, it was a change of circumstances. And, I talk about this in my book. I did a photo memoir called Guitar with Wings. Yes. That was all the pictures I took during the Back to the Egg sessions. And writing that book really gave me a certain amount of space just to kind of revisit my experiences from that era and kind of look at it with the eyes of the present, and there was certainly, I mean, it did provide a certain kind of stability. And I think that allowed me to start exploring the more artistic aspects of music. Being around Paul and being around an artist like that, as opposed to where my goal had always been, be the best musician I could be the best guitar player I could be, but I never really had any consideration of writing, of composing. That was something that really started to develop during the time with Wings.
I mean, I couldn't imagine a greater sense of validation as a guitarist than being picked for Wings. I couldn't imagine my ego growing any bigger if something like that happened to me.
It was pretty cool, but but working with Paul doesn't let you get. It was extremely cool, but working with Paul doesn't let your ego take over, because he's very demanding. I mean, you can't just rest on your, oh great, I'm playing with Paul, I can just rest on my laurels. I mean, That was just the beginning of digging deeper, and he's really good as a producer. He's really good at bringing out that the deeper stuff.
I guess you couldn't go in with any sense of ego, but were you aware of the band's history at this point? Were you aware that 5 members had come and gone before you?
No, I was very much aware of the band's history, but that wasn't really a factor in my decision.
Like, were you aware of kind of accusations that Wings was like a backing band? Because kind of for me, the fact that you're there to kind of support Paul is a great part of the gig as a band member in the first place. I never see why that was seen as such a bad aspect of the band.
Well, I mean, Paul encouraged us to think of it as a band. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't just Paul's backing group. Because Denny and Linda were integral to it, and it was a very, and of course, Paul being the major artistic force there, sure, it certainly was unavoidable, but it wasn't simply Paul McCartney plus backing group. I mean, there was a band sensibility at play, and remember, Back to the Egg is credited to Wings, not Paul McCartney and Wings.
That is a very distinctive part, because obviously Red Rose Speedway was Paul McCartney and Wings.
Right.
Of course. Not to sound too prying, I don't know how far gossip travelled in circles in those pre-internet days, or how much of Melody Maker you may have read, but had you heard much about Paul's recording process and how he'd like to work, and how kind of demanding and not obsessive but very passionate he was, and how much of a force in the studio he could have been?
I mean, I had some awareness of it, but I had, as a studio musician, I had worked with all kinds of producers and artists who had various different ways of working. I think the biggest issue, or the biggest difference in terms of when we started recording with Wings, was how much more time there was to work on things. I mean, I was used to walking into sessions where you do 3 tunes in 3 hours. Whereas, to have a whole day to cut a track, or sometimes even longer, was a great luxury. And of course, under those circumstances, you also have to know how to fill your time effectively, because sometimes you can find yourself just kind of waiting around for an overdub to be done, or for some, or the snare drum sound to be fixed, or whatever. So, that would be my cue to kind of grab my acoustic and go off in a corner and just kind of, work things out, start working on stuff of my own. I can't say that Paul's workflow was that different from any other artist that I've worked with, perhaps only to the extent that he was able to draw on a much deeper well of studio creativity by virtue of just the intensity of the Beatles stuff. But, and by this time, of course, in that era, you have, there's 4 kids. James is not even a year old when I joined the band. And Linda, has her hands full with the kids. And certainly, she was deeply involved with the band, but there were also times when she might not be in the studio. And, Paul would show up, and it would be, like when we did Maisie, for example, Linda was not in the studio that day. Otherwise, she would have played on it too. So I think that, nothing out of the ordinary other than the fact, of course, that it was Paul McCartney, and therefore there was a certain mojo that just is natural to his sensibility.
So you got the gig again. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were friends with Denny Lane. So how far back did you two go?
Well, I'd worked with Denny. No, I wasn't. Yeah, Steve was closer to Denny because I think they were neighbors. I had worked with Denny. I was playing in the house band on a TV show with David Essex, and Denny was a guest on the show, and he liked my playing. We did Go Now, and he liked my playing, and was recommended me to Paul. And that was kind of what led to it. But there was a long period in between. I mean, I worked with Denny in September of '77. I got the call in April. But in the interim, I had actually run into Paul. I actually met Paul for the first time at a studio in North London when he was there working on the Wings Over America stuff. I actually ran into him. I was with Herbie Flowers, the bass player, on a jingle session, and we went to the men's room and ran into Paul in the bathroom. I mean, it was a
very surreal
an inauspicious place. Yeah, inauspicious place to meet Paul. And then I had also run into Paul, Linda, and Denny at Air Studios a few months later when I think they were working on the Oriental Nightfish. The animation, and they were doing a mix of the track for that.
Yes, I've seen that film. It's very weird. It's a very interesting Lynn McCartney composition, I must admit. Was Steve Holley kind of someone you could kind of relate to on this crazy ride because you joined the band at the same time? Was he kind of comrade in arms against the whole band?
Oh yeah, I mean, Steve and I were definitely kind of comrades in arms, and in fact, after Back to the Edge came out, he and I were the ones that went out and did all the early promotion for the album. Let's see, that was when we went to Europe, and then we went to New York, and it was we definitely, we had a lot in common because we were of similar age and similar backgrounds, and we just kind of bonded, as being the new guys, So the first photo sessions we did were just the two of us, and all that kind of stuff.
So, you've joined the band by now, you've met Paul several times. How long is it before you feel comfortable enough to start annoying him with random Beatles trivia questions?
Oh, I really didn't do that.
You were restrained.
I was not a Beatles trivia nut in that respect. Right. The fandom part of it really, I think, it belonged to my kind of early teens.
Right.
At that point, it was a professional relationship. He didn't really talk much about the Beatles.
I imagined.
But then, once in a while, Yoko would do something and Paul would get peeved about it, and we'd hear, some story or other. And then occasionally he would talk about it. But I mean, by comparison, George seemed to love to talk about the Beatles. Oh. Whereas Paul, at that time, Paul was he was just beginning to kind of step out from under the Beatles shadow. I mean, we did some Beatle tunes as part of the concert set. I mean, we opened with Got to Get You Into My Life. I think part of that was because Earth, Wind and Fire had the single out from the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack. The Sgt. Pepper movie soundtrack, and Paul was that got Paul excited about it because we had a horn section and we could kind of work in that, work with that, and we did Let It Be, Fool on the Hill, and always Yesterday, but there wasn't a lot of direct Beatle stuff. I mean, I actually got more trivia from Chris Thomas.
Oh, really?
Because Chris had all kinds of stories to tell, working on the White Album and stuff like that.
Were there any Beatles songs that you would have loved to have played in the tour, or were you very happy with the selections that you got in the end?
I was happy with what we did. We did rehearse. I think we rehearsed things we said today.
Did you ever get much time alone with Paul? And I know it's kind of a stupid question, a simple question, but did you ever have much one-on-one with him, or was it always kind of like within the band context?
No, I mean there was plenty of one-on-one. There were, times when there was few particular occasions when we were working at Lynn Castle. I remember one time I was just kind of noodling on this little composition that I had, and Paul said, "Oh, let's record." He walked in, said, "Let's record it," and so we recorded that. And then another time that I got to the studio earlier, I was just kind of jamming on my electric, and Paul walked in, sat down at the drums, and we ended up laying down a track together, just the two of us, which ended up becoming the basic track for that weird Robbers Ball tune. And there were times when we would just sit and chat. I mean, there was, it was very relaxed. Although I spent more one-on-one time with Linda,
Oh, okay.
I think. Linda, because Linda was very cool to hang out with.
So how long did it take before you kind of Paul was humanised to you? Was it quite instant? We kind of like, oh, he's just a real guy, kind of quickly.
Yeah. I mean, it's when you're a professional musician, you have to immediately step beyond the fandom aspect of it, and you have to go into human mode and artists, the artistry of it, because otherwise it gets, the other stuff can get in the way. It can. And you want to be able to do the job that you're there to do.
One of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, this was a song that was featured in the concert for Kampuchea, obviously, and was part of the Wings set list back in 1979. You guys did Cook of the House. I just wanted to ask you, was that a song you enjoyed playing at all?
Oh, it was fun. I mean, it was Linda's little showcase.
Because I must admit, she did it better live than she ever did on Speed of Sound, I must admit.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, Linda could certainly pull off the backing vocals and the keyboard parts, and in that case, the lead vocal. I think it's a shame she didn't get to do more of that stuff.
Yeah, I guess with a lot of the other members of Wings, they met Linda throughout various stages of her musical experience. You obviously had met the most veteran and experienced Linda of all the Lindas that any other band members met. Did she seem a lot more confident as a band member and as a performer in those latter years with the band? Oh
yeah, I mean certainly you didn't have the kind of thing that happened, early on when she would freeze.
In '62, yeah, in the Over Europe tour. It's a very famous story of. I guess by then she would have just accepted that she is within this band. I honestly don't know where the criticism really came from, because for me personally, as a man in love himself, the idea of being in a band with one's partner is just horribly romantic and endearing, and I think that she's in the band at all is what was in the band was a wonderful addition, and it isn't Wings without Linda. Really.
Yeah, and that's why there's never been a Wings reunion.
Of course.
Because Paul won't do Wings without Linda.
Now, before we get on to Back to the Egg, I don't want to keep it for too long. I also want to talk about the unfortunate end, the dissolution of Wings, as it were. Obviously, Paul's drug bust was the beginning of the end. It was more of a whimper than a bang.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the Back to the Egg era. Our era of Wings was like the Indian summer of the group. But in some respects, Wings was already kind of. Certainly Linda was, I think, having, 4 kids, done the big world tour. Mm-hmm. I think Linda was kind of getting to the point where it was becoming a bit too much. And I think but it got reinvigorated for the period that we were in it. Partially, I think that was because Paul had signed with Columbia Records, so new record label, new direction, a more rock direction musically, and we had some big hits during that era. I mean, Goodnight Tonight did very well.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
Coming Up did very well. And I think Coming Up in particular kind of pinpoints the issue that on one hand you have Paul wanting to, I mean, as he did eventually with Tug of War, going off on a much more pop direction. And you have Wings that are really kind of forged itself in our incarnation as a rock band. And so you have this kind of, you know, the live version of Coming Up with this quirky techno, or rather the studio version of Coming Up with the quirky techno pop, and the live version, which is kind of a rock dance record.
It is.
Which is an interesting phenomenon because people, you know, like with Goodnight Tonight, because Columbia Records put out what they called a disco 12-inch single of it, people kind of thought of that as a disco record, but I played on a lot of disco records, especially a French artist named Cerrone. I played on a lot of his tracks. And I knew what disco was, and Goodnight Tonight wasn't disco. In fact, you listen to the live version from the Glasgow, like the Last Flight bootleg, and it sounds more like kind of Spanish-influenced rock dance music. You know, so the fact is the last two Wings hits were both dance records, and which I thought was kind of rock dance records, which I thought was kind of an interesting. It's an interesting perspective.
Whenever I listen to Old Siam Sir, I always feel like that was meant to be a bigger single than it was. I just feel like there was such an energy and pep and excitement behind it. I don't know why it isn't a wider kind of hit in the Wings canon.
I think the issue with that in America, where it would have been a bigger hit, I think, but the timing was unfortunate because the Knack's My Sharona came out exactly the same time, right. And that had a very similar beat to it. Right. In fact, I mean, my late friend Bruce Gary was the drummer in the Knack, and that rhythm was his signature rhythm. It's ironic because he never got credited as a songwriter on that, but in fact, it's really based on his beat, and so that similarity, I think, because the Knack's record kind of beat the Wings record to it, to the top of the charts. It tended to, and it was also, you have this kind of nascent new wave, kind of a little bit of a backlash against the established rock artists in favor of these, you know, the new younger musicians.
Yes.
So that you know, the timing was a little unfortunate, but you got to also remember, I think that Paul wouldn't put Goodnight Tonight on Back to the Egg, and I think stylistically it was a reasonable choice, but from a commercial point of view, it was not the best choice because it would have sold a lot more albums if the hit single had been on the album. And in a sense, the hit single from Back to the Egg was Goodnight Tonight, you know, from that era. And the tracks, the album tracks themselves were not necessarily fully configured. I have a theory that if Arrow Through Me had been done in a more conventionally Wings fashion, that could have been a much bigger hit, because that was a very cool song.
The ending is very cool. The ending is fantastic. It builds wonderfully, doesn't it?
But Paul took it kind of, it was almost like anticipating the way that he would go with McCartney too. And I think that's my one regret on Back to the Egg, is that particular track didn't get done in a more commercial way. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I mean, it's very cool. And you know, like, I know Erykah Badu took the intro and looped it and wrote a whole new song over the top of it. You know, there's a coolness factor about it, and in some respects, it's kind of a generation ahead of its time. But and another one that didn't even make it on the album, there was a song called Cage that is kind of a mashup of some different stylistic elements, but there's a big ballad that is the core of that song that, if it had been done as a standalone song, I think could have been a hit record too. So I think, you know, that one can look back and kind of deconstruct the progress, the commercial progress of that album. But for me, the most gratifying thing is the fact that even though at the time the critics were very, very critical of it, in the course of time, that album has been reevaluated and has gone from a 2-star album to a 4-star album in critical review.
Was the critical backlash of the last 2 albums ever something that was in your mind whilst recording Back to the Egg, or was the whole experience a little fresher?
I mean, we just did what we did, you know. I mean, I can't speak to what was in Paul's mind. And I know that he has a little bit of a hands-off approach to Back to the Egg, and I think it looks like to London Town too. And I think that his assessment tends to be based on the hits. You know, and the big hit from the London Town era was Mull of Kintyre, which wasn't on the album.
Yes.
So it tends to color his perception of all of that. But I think that, you know, I think that but having Chris Thomas there as the co-producer the intention was to be able to steer it into a more rock direction. And so I think there was a perception of striking out in a slightly different way, especially having a new band, having new blood in the band.
Yeah, well, for example, critics always seem to, whenever they write about the band, they always use the words new wave and punk. Was there ever a moment when you were in the studio where you sat down and those words were ever said aloud, or is that just the end result and how people interpreted what you came up with?
Well, I think that Paul had a great awareness of what was going on in the pop scene because, you know, Heather was listening to a lot. Heather, you know, Linda's daughter, Heather, who was, 16, 17 at the time, was listening to a lot of that stuff. It was very much in the air. And I think that there was, you know, I think Paul was responding to that kind of fresh wind that was blowing through the business. And those songs, I mean, especially, you know, the first song we recorded for Egg was To You, which, you know, it has a very edgy kind of sensibility to it. You know, especially, you know, with the weird manipulation of the lead guitar sound on that too, which kind of almost anticipated what Yes would do a few years later with Owner of a Lonely Heart, running the guitar solo through a harmonizer and kind of, you know, just making a different sonic picture out of it. There was certainly that kind of experimentation going on. It wasn't, let's go in and make a conventional record by any means.
Yes, it's very daring for a Wings album, I must admit. I'll admit that when this podcast started, it was based on me not being a completist. I had not heard Back to the Egg. I'd pretty much heard McCartney 1, Ram, and Band on the Run when I started. And it's been a journey, you know, for me as it has been for the audience. And, you know, after constant replays of Back to the Egg whilst riding my bike to and from work, it's become obvious to me that the first side of that album, plus the Rockestra theme on the start of the day, is possibly one of the best single sides of any Wings album. And I'm glad history has been much kinder to it. I'm glad that it has been part of that McCartney revisionist history. Albums like Flowers in the Dirt or Press to Play have seen a slight fan base creeping back in these last few years. And it's great to see certain albums that may have been forgotten coming back. Songs like Spin It On For Me and Arrow Right Through Me and Baby's Request are the part of those undiscovered gems. You know, gems like Beware My Love from Speed of Sound, for example. When you were sat in the studio, were you kind of aware or dreading the day that he was going to come up to you with the latest Honey Pie or You Gave Me the Answer or Maxwell's Silver Hammer?
No, because on that album it was Baby's Request, which we actually did as a demo for the Mills Brothers. I mean, it wasn't even originally intended for Back to the Egg. We demoed it to give to the Mills Brothers because Paul had seen them on vacation in France and thought, I'll write them a song. And we did a demo of it, and it was actually ended up to be so cool that we said, let's put it on the record. You know, and it's interesting because I personally also, I like side 2 of Egg just as much as I like side 1. There are things about side 2. I mean, So Glad to See You Here, I think, is a great rock song, would have made a great single. that there was never any thought about doing that.
Yes.
But American radio always loved Paul's rock voice, which is why Coming Up was a hit. And so glad to see you here. Especially with that and Old Siam, so where he's singing right at the top of his range, and he's just nailing the vocal. And things like Love Awake and Winter Rose Love Awake. I mean, there's something very charming about that stuff, and it draws on the fact that the English rock tradition, especially when you look to Zeppelin, for example. Not that I'm making any comparison between Zeppelin and Wings directly, but the fact is that there is a folk music component in English rock that is never that far away from the surface. That a lot of what Zeppelin was doing was kind of was basically almost like electric folk music at times, and at least from my perception. And there was a folk element in the Beatles too. I mean, especially the White Album period with Blackbird and with Mother Nature's Son and stuff like that. It's very much part of Paul's musical sensibility. And I think that there are stronger moments perhaps on side one, but I think side two for me holds together pretty well. I just never quite grasped the concept of the broadcast, other than it being kind of a quirky thing, kind of a quirky interlude. I think there were other potential songs like Cage that, if we had finished it off to our satisfaction, would have sat in there perhaps more effectively.
There's a segment on our show called Cannon Fodder, where I kind of pick the key songs from each album, and I always take requests whenever I have a guest on the show. What would you say would be the 3 key songs from Back to the Egg that you would like to stand the test of time and people to revisit?
Well, I think Spin It On, certainly. Spin It On, and I think Rockestra, and probably, I mean, in the Wings context, and I know this may seem a little left field, but because Denny was a crucial part of the band, I think that again and again and again should be given some attention.
You do not have to apologise for that. That's a fantastic song with a great chorus, and the group harmonies on that are fantastic as well. On that, one kind of last major question before I start wrapping this thing up, I know you have to go soon. Did you ever feel like you had to work against Paul at all? And I only ask because there doesn't seem to be any tales of controversy or conflict surrounding any of the production of Back to the Egg at all, which for this show is very rare. Is that a truly accurate kind of representation of the whole affair?
Yeah, I mean, it was, pretty much. I mean, I know that there was some conflict between Paul and Denny, but overall in the work environment, it went pretty smoothly. I mean, I think the album could have got done quicker, but I think it was just normal kind of par for the course to take a lengthy time to do it. But in terms of the work environment, I mean, I can't think of a particular circumstance where there was a critique that caused any kind of conflict. But the one area I think that could have been handled differently was Arrow Through Me, because with that one, basically Paul kind of pulled Steve Holley into the studio and threw an all-nighter doing it, and we never really got to kind of work the track the way that we might have worked it if we'd actually just cut it as a band.
Of course. And Wings was always better as a band, not as its individual members. It was definitely one of those.
Right, because the nature of Wings was that it was a band. It wasn't just Paul McCartney's backing group. And the more successful aspect, with the exception of Band on the Run, which kind of stands on its own, I think the more successful aspects of the band were the more collaborative stuff, where it really felt more band-like.
I'm always a massive proponent of Wildlife. There's a real intimate and tender sound on that album that was just never captured again by Paul throughout his whole career, unfortunately.
Well, that album was basically kind of a one-day job.
It was
just
fantastic,
run in the studio and make an album. Yeah, that's one you need to talk to Denny Sywell about, because he has the insights on that.
Yes, Denny Sywell, someone who I'm looking to get on the show soon. Obviously, work my way up to Denny Lane, and then I will get the world famous billionaire to come on my poxy little podcast. Hopefully, after that.
Yeah, but I think you'll be lucky if you can get Paul to voice any opinions about this stuff. Yeah, to be honest, the reality of it is that I know from my own experience, I have forgotten a great deal of the stuff that I've recorded. Because you make a record, you get really intensely, deeply into it. It comes out, you only can play a few of the tunes in concert.
And then you move on.
And then the others just kind of go, basically become part of your catalog. Yeah, no, Back to the Egg was the first album that I had my face on. It wasn't the first album that I was,
featured on.
Had my name on.
No, of course.
In credits, yeah.
I'm going to wrap this up, Lawrence, because I know you have places to be, obviously.
Yeah, I have to eat lunch.
Yes, no, you sound absolutely famished on this end. My guilt is endless. I must admit, I'm eternally grateful to have you on the show, Lawrence. I haven't even got through probably about a third of the questions I've actually written down that I wanted to ask you. Maybe someday in the future we'll have you on again. I can pry your brain once more.
Of course,
it's been
yeah.
absolutely wonderful to have you on the show.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I'm always happy to discuss this stuff. And if people want to kind of get a perspective on my experience with it and see some of the pictures that I took, my book, Guitar with Wings, is a good entry point for that.
I would be lying if I said that I hadn't bought that on Amazon 2 days ago. I cannot wait for it to arrive. Lawrence, it's been absolutely fantastic discovering your story on my own. I must admit, I thought we would just be...
Welcome to Paul or Nothing, the place to get all of your Pauls all of the time. Join me, your host Sam Wiles, as we discover the history, the music, and the man behind it all, Paul McCartney. To get in contact with the show, email us at
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Sam. And good luck to you.
You take care, Lawrence. You have a wonderful day and enjoy your lunch. Enjoy your lunch, sir.
Thanks. All right. And cheers. Bye-bye.